So, with that done, we can actually move on to the first topic, which is, of course, a quarter of all LGBT plus hate crime victims are afraid of UK police. Are you back, Levi?
Yeah,
Okay,
I got that.
I just
Sorry.
wanted to check before moving ahead. Um, so yes, this came along as Gallup released its 2021 hate crime report, and the findings have been rather illuminating in many different ways in showing a lot of issues with the current system. But first, let's discuss what a lot of the other people reporting on the Gallup report have kind of discussed, and most of the focus has been put on the needs of hate crime victims and how they're not being met. For example, quote, only 1 in 3 respondents who wanted or needed support, 58%, were able to access it. 21%, end quote. The 58%, I believe, was all those people who responded, and then 21% of. I'm trying to figure
Uh,
it
so
out.
so out of the people who responded,
Mm,
the ones who needed 58% needed support, and
right.
only
I don't need
21%
20.
could
Okay.
access it.
Yeah, that took me a while to calculate. Sorry about that.
Statistics are
Again.
hard. Statistics are very hard,
Yeah.
and neither of us are that good at maths. So
Yeah, so it's like that's what a lot of people have been focusing on. This is actually what led me to find the hate crime report. I believe Pink News ran an article pointing out that only 1 in 3 respondents who are victims of hate crime who wanted or needed support had access to it. Um, and this is a big issue. It shows a glaring flaw in the current system. It shows how the idea of hate crime is over. We don't really need to, at least queer hate crime is over. We don't need to think about it. It's so rare, etc. Anyone who's a victim of hate crime receives the support they need, etc. That's just not true on any level. Um, and again, going forward in this report, quote, 64% of respondents had experienced anti-LGBT plus violence or abuse, whilst 36% had not, end quote. So that is a significant portion of the LGBT plus community that has experienced anti-LGBT plus violence in the UK. This is not something small. This is a big issue. Um, so, we received a $5 donation from the Graceful Gamer. Hi Levi, hi Ethel, I hope the stream goes well. Good luck with everything. Thank you. you know, Thank you very much. Hopefully it goes well. Sorry. Collecting my thoughts again. So again, it kind of points out to the facts that hate crimes are not a bygone thing, as sadly a lot of people are acting. I've been noticing the last several years, people have been acting more and more like anti-queer hate crimes are a thing of the past, they're so last century, etc. And that's just not what we're seeing. Okay, moving forward, quote, respondents who had experienced anti-LGBT plus violence and abuse were asked how often they experienced this. Almost a fifth of respondents experienced violence and abuse daily, 16%. More than 1/3 experienced it at least weekly, 36%. And almost 2/3 experienced it at least monthly, while some respondents experienced anti-LGBT plus violence or abuse relatively infrequently, e.g. yearly. For the majority of participants, it was a regular and frequent occurrence. For those LGBT plus individuals, such incidents were routine and a common feature of their everyday lives. Elaborating on this, that should be end quote. Elaborating on this, quote, the most commonly experienced form was verbal abuse, 92%, followed by online abuse, 60%, and harassment, 59%. 29% of respondents had been subject to physical violence, 28% had been outed or doxed, and 17% had experienced sexual violence. 13% had their property damaged, and 8% had been blackmailed, and 6% had something stolen from them. End quote. So, again, this is a real pervasive issue. Nearly 30% have experienced physical violence, and like the rest of the violence should also not be ignored, of course. But that shows that it's not even just verbal abuse, as a lot of people think. The assaults are still going on. And at the end of this, the report noted the facts that 13% of the people who'd been targets of hate crime were severely impacted, 24% significantly impacted, 33% moderately impacted, 24% mildly impacted, and 6% were not impacted by what happened to them. That's 70% who were moderately to severely impacted by their experience. So, hate crime is something that continues to be a very real issue in the UK. And it's something that the government seems to have no interest in actually tackling. We've seen the spike in hate crimes recently. Following Brexit in particular, all forms of hate crime increased. It wasn't just racist hate crimes that increased following that. It kind of emboldened the bigots, made them feel like they could target anyone that they wanted to target. And so every group, every demographic started to experience just a surge in hate crime. Then, of course, we had the anti-trans rhetoric spike up again. A lot of that has brought into public discourse the same tired old, oh, well, think about the children, which, whilst many of the transphobes would, say, oh, but we're just criticizing trans people, is going to impact the queer community at large as well. This is something that I've pointed out before. Bigotry, you can't be selective with bigotry. The example I dealt with before is telling someone that if you discriminate against trans people in sport because they're a danger to women in sport, bigots are just going to take that rhetoric and use the climate it forms to present them as a danger in every field of life, from bathrooms, changing rooms, refuges, crisis centres. They're just going to take it and run with it. Because it doesn't matter about the specificity. If they're a danger in one way, they can be a danger in another. And as we've seen here, if you present trans people as a danger, our society is just going to take that and present it as all queer people as a danger. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I can't really think of anything to add, no. I think you covered everything pretty well.
This also comes at the fact that it comes at a time when the UK government for the last 6 years has been withdrawing a lot of government funding from LGBT plus support charities, like the one that I used to work at. So they're actively taking money away from services which are needed. That this isn't just something that happened. This is part of what the Tory government is creating in the UK. They're taking money away from essential support services, and that's just leaving a lot of LGBT plus people out in the wild with absolutely no support. So that needs to be noted. But on top of that, it's not just the removal of funding. In the UK, we've also seen the government targeting the LGBT plus community. We've seen it particularly in relation to trans folk. We'll come to the bathroom story later. But we've seen it with the Equalities Minister coming out and stating that she plans to do away with identity culture and all this sort of stuff, when it's literally her job to protect marginalized groups. And she's saying that, no, we've sacrificed too much of our freedom, too much of our liberty. We need a Ministry of Freedom to replace the Ministry of Equalities. So there's that, and it's just in general, there is this constant barrage of aggravating and legitimizing queerphobia, specifically transphobia. We saw this with the GRA reform. They did the whole consultation. The papers whipped everyone up into a frenzy, into a panic, and the government was like pushing ahead with it until they got the results back of their consultation, only to find out that the vast majority of the UK population does not agree with their transphobic perspective, so they just abandoned it. But by that point, the damage had already been done. Trans rights had already been put forward as a debate. They had already been put forward as a danger to women and children. So, you know, there is this legitimizing factor going on with the British government. And bigots are running on that. You know, bigotry and hate crime is not just a bad apple situation. It's not just a one-off. It is something that is cultivated by the social environment, and this is the environment the UK government is pushing. Yes. Now, this is where we come to the part that I haven't seen papers discussed. They may have. I may have just missed something. But when I checked for this, like I checked a few queer sites, and I didn't really see them focusing on this. They were focusing more on the lack of support, which again is important, definitely important. But that's the facts that only 1 in 8 people who had been the victim of anti-LGBT plus hate crimes reported the incident to police. To quote the actual survey, quote, only 1 in 8 respondents reported their experiences to the police, 13%. Less than half of respondents who reported to the police were satisfied with the response they received, 46%, end quote. So that right there shows a massive issue. There is clearly either a lack of knowledge about the fact that you can report a hate crime, or there's a lack of trust going on, and we'll go into which is which later. But the fact remains, even when they do report an issue, only, just over half of them are satisfied with the police's response. Now, there could be various different reasons for this. As mentioned,
Sorry, doesn't it say under half of them were satisfied with the police response?
Sorry,
46?
yes, 46% were satisfied. I got it wrong. So over half were not satisfied. I do apologise. Thanks for catching that, Levi.
It's going to be my job because I was too lazy to actually prepare any stories for this stream. I'm just going to catch all of your errors.
So on one side we have the notion that people they don't know that they can report a hate crime. On the other, we have that there is deterrence going on. And this is possibly due to police violence, especially towards trans and black, brown and indigenous people of colour. Thankfully, the report went into detail. They actually looked into people's reasons for not reporting. So, out of the... I'm just having a look. It's 87. Out of the 87 who did not respond, did not report the issue to the police, 54% felt that the police would do nothing. 13% had previous bad experience with reporting to the police. 28% disliked or were afraid of police. And this is sort of where the Eureka moment came from, because even like the Gallup poll doesn't really tell you the exact number. When you have a percentage of a percentage, we as people tend to have this propensity to just kind of switch off our brain. It's much harder to visualize a percentage of a percentage. So we actually decided, let's make it easy. What percent of all victims of LGBT plus hate crime could be noted as being either not liking or being afraid of the police? So we did the maths on that, and it means at least 24.36% of all LGBT plus hate crime victims are afraid of or dislike the police. Enough, and dislike is a very nebulous term, but this is dislike enough that they didn't report a literal crime against them, So I need to point that fact out because, again, I know some people might tag on to what dislike means. Dislike means hate something enough that you don't report it. And it should also be noted here that 24.36% is a low estimate. Now, why do I say that? Well, this is only the people who didn't report who said this. There's also the fact that people who did report hate crime may also dislike or be afraid of police. Now, some people might go, "Oh, how can that be the case? How can someone report something to the police, but dislike or be afraid of them?" And there's several responses to that. Maybe the violence against them was so atrocious that they're more fearful of a second episode, reoccurring violence against them, so they had to turn to police. There's also the possibility that they fear blowback or DARVO. As we've seen, DARVO is a very effective tool against the queer community. It's a very effective tool against many marginalized groups. For those who don't know what DARVO is, it's deny offense, attack the accuser, and reverse victim and offender.
Specifically, DARVO, DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim, offender.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
So yes, that's what that refers to. I have an experience, and that's the thing. I always link back to it, but it gave a lot. When 2019 happened, we had to go to the police. Adita was, one former practicing lawyer. I was worried about what could happen if British police got involved, contacted Indian police, Indian police find out I'm transphobia in the Indian police force, or if there was a miscommunication, it could fuck with my visa. There are so many ways that could have transpired as violence against me. So the moment everything happened, we had to preemptively go down. We went to the nearest police station. We went several times. And each time, I came out of it, I know I'm very pale, but I was an unhealthy greenish white when I came out because it was such a horrific fucking experience. The probing questions, about stuff that's completely unrelated, but I have to answer because if I react with hostility, you don't need to know about this stuff, about my, being trans. That could result in potential issues for us. But we had to do it because the risk of not involving them was so great that, hey, we have no choice in this, okay? And honestly, it's such a harrowing experience. I don't think I've actually talked about, my experience at the stations on here or in any of my work, but it was not fun. People think it's a very easy thing. You just walk into the police, you have a nice little chat like you see on fucking TV shows. No, it's not. There was a lot of invasive fucking questions, and again, about stuff that's completely unrelated. But that's the thing, they have the power, and if they decided to, they could make mine and Adita's life a living hell. So we had to cut that off, and I get the feeling that we're probably not the only ones who have been put in a similar situation. So again, even out of those who have reported, a number of them were likely fucking terrified, even re-traumatized by being forced to do that. So this 24% is the low end. That's what we can confirm. That we can confirm out of all victims of anti-LGBT plus hate crime, that's how many are at least dislike or afraid of police.
Sorry, go on. I have my own anecdote about why I reported to the police despite being afraid of them and disliking them as well, which is probably more in line, I think, with what more people would do compared to your situation.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, I kind of had the opposite experience. There was no probing questions. There was no interview. I walked in and I said, there's a very dangerous person in this area who's done this, and this very, very serious thing.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to do something about it. And they were like, what do you want us to do about it? We can't do anything because we don't feel like it.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried going back to them more than once, even though every single time I left feeling like I don't know how to describe how crushing it is to have someone say, no, we're not going to prosecute the person who abused you, who threatened people's lives, who gave you PTSD, and not even say sorry. Just say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. Like, I cannot describe how horrible that feels. But I risked it again and again and again, because even the chance of something being done was, it was not worth risking leaving any avenue of, I guess, progress unchecked. Putting myself through that horrific experience was worth it if it meant that I could potentially be a little bit safer. Of course, that didn't concern LGBT plus hate crime so much, but it's the same principle, where feeling dehumanized and feeling hurt and being traumatized is often worth seeing if there's even a chance of getting help if your situation is dire enough.
It's a lesser of two evils situation, but the lesser of two evils is still fucking evil. That's something that a lot of people seem to forget. Like, we're in a fucking system where, we don't have much choice. And thankfully, like, we are both white. That's the one thing we both have going for us. Like, we're going to come to later, like, the survivor bias in, like, selection. But yeah, because I think you wanted to also talk about the other statistics that I mentioned.
Yeah, so when I was just looking through the agenda one more time before the stream, just to try and get an idea of what we're talking about, and I realized, hang on a second, this little equation we did to figure out this 24.36% number, we can do that to the other percentages as well. Also, if you're wondering how to calculate percent of a percent, it's not hard to look up, but I might as well tell you. You just convert the percentages into decimals and then multiply them together. So I did that for the previous bad experience of reporting to the police. 0.13 times 0.87, and it came out to about 11%. So more than 1 in 10 people who went to the extent of trying to go to the police had such a bad experience that they did not want to try it again.
Yeah. And we should be clear that bad experience is, like, separate to, like, they weren't satisfied with police. Like, they weren't satisfied was much higher. So, like, we're on about, like, violence from police in this regard. So, person has been victim of a hate crime, goes to the police, and the police double down on that violence. 1 in 10 victims of LGBT plus hate crime have had that experience. So,
and this also includes people who were afraid of police and went ahead with it anyway and got burned so badly, even with such low expectations, that they did not want to try again. Which is the point I'm at this stage with my situation. And that was after trying to go to the police, I think, about 3 times. So it is not an insignificant, like 1 in 10 is already a bad number, but when you factor in all of that, and I believe also, Ethel, you pointed out there was some survivorship bias with that.
Because there's social awareness in the queer community with the intersections of, ethnicity, class, disability, being trans or cis, there is an awareness about the fact that if you're black, if you're trans, if you're disabled and you go to the police, you are most likely to experience that violence. So there is a selection process going on here, a self-selection process where, a black disabled queer person is the least likely to go to police compared to a white cis gay person. So there is that social awareness. Like, you talk to any queer person of colour, and they will explain to you, like, there's this awareness. So there's already that selection process going on. So white, upper class, cis gay men are going to be overrepresented compared to black, trans, disabled, women, non-binary folk, etc. So there is already that going on. And even with, the police receiving I'm trying to think here, a perfect victim scenario where they're getting a disproportionate amount that fit their idea of a model assimilated queer person, in spite of that selection process going on, 1 in 10 still have that bad experience. So, again, this number would probably be higher if everyone felt they could go to police. So until the issue is actually fucking resolved, pushing for more queer people to go to police without tackling, like, the systemic issues going on, all you're going to do is send more people to the meat grinder, And this really does speak to the need for systemic changes, the need for entirely new institutions. It was fucking disappointing last year to see how many queer people just, again, very often the same queer people who are disproportionately going to be overrepresented going to the fucking police, how many of them just refused to, like, listen to black voices last year and the year before. It's like, honestly, we need the same fucking changes. We need, police to be swapped for something. And the people who are in policing, like, they can be no part of that. It's not about changing the name of police to some other institution and then, like, keeping the same old fucking people. You can't do that. That doesn't deal with canteen culture and everything like that. For those who don't know what canteen culture is, it's a specific term that refers to a social phenomenon in UK police, though it can be applied elsewhere. I've seen it's generally applicable. It's that in-group culture of police officers. Everyone who shares the same canteen, they watch each other's back, they cover for one another, not just in the field, but when covering for things like extorting money, racist crime, sexist crime, homophobic crime, etc. There's this insular sort of community. It grinds down any new recruits. They either assimilate into that canteen culture, or they will be ostracized, put on their own, put their lives at risk, and to the point that they just leave, or in some cases in the US, might even get shot in the back. It's all part of that culture, and you can't just, you can't change names, you can't just educate that out of the system until the whole thing is torn out. That is going to maintain itself. It's a self-maintaining system. I'm just reading some comments here. Steph K, disappointed but unsurprised. Yeah, it's kind of, yeah. Then we have, I've never gone to the police, even when my throat was crushed, and I do not answer the door for police. That's fair. And then we have, I was thinking about this yesterday. If an LGBTQ plus person goes to the police to report a crime, either hate crime or sexual violence, they will not be taken seriously. Yeah, that was just wind. I don't know if you heard that bang. That was just wind throwing something around. Suddenly it's getting very windy. But yes, it's and as this report shows, it's not just you who thinks like this. This is a shared experience. This didn't just.
Police, sorry. The police also don't take sexual violence seriously. Yeah. Either way, they love nothing more than just doing nothing when people report sexual violence. It's almost like they have a thing for it. It's weird.
They lost interest in preventing sexual assault when women gained more autonomy. Literally, they used to really harshly police adultery, especially of women. back when women were seen as property and were unable to like have a bank account or own land or property, etc. And the same was for rape. They would actually police that harshly. But the moment that got removed, they lost interest. When they saw violence against women as a property crime, then it was something that they would do. But now they don't. So yeah.
That explains a lot. Yeah, not just because the police only seem to take property crime seriously, but also because of, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hate the society.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, not that I can think of. We can move on to the next point.
Quote, 8 in 10 respondents who accessed LGBT plus specific support were satisfied with the service they received, 80%, compared to only 4 in 10 respondents who accessed generic support, 38%, end quote. So again, this is really important. There's actually another point that they go on to discuss, which is how only 42% of those who attended general services said they were treated with respect versus 85% of those who attended LGBT plus specific services. And both of these points, these statistics, point to the fact that there is still a need for LGBT plus specific services out there. Again, we're at a point where, like, especially a lot of cis-het people think the March for Equality ended with the changes in marriage laws in the UK. I won't say marriage equality because there is no marriage equality. Disabled people who are receiving disability allowances risk losing that if they get married. Trans people who are previously who are already married have to get permission from their partner in order to change their marriage certificate, the gender on the marriage certificate. And now you'd hope in regards to the trans person that if they were doing that, they'd be with someone supportive, but it still gives a potentially abusive partner leverage, that control.
It sends a really horrible message.
Yeah.
That even if you have a supportive partner, they shouldn't have that power anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It gives partners the right to veto official documents. So again, it's not marriage equality. It is just, same gender couples were now allowed to marry. So it's not marriage equality. I want to make that clear because that's I know a lot of people talk about marriage equality was achieved, and people think that's the end of the thing. But marriage equality wasn't even achieved, and yet so many people, primarily cis-het people, but also a considerable portion of the assimilationist gay community, believe that's where everything ended. Equality was achieved, and this sort of points to the fact that no, we can't even get support from a generic service and be treated like a human being half of the time. That's how fucking awful the situation is. And it's not a case of, hypersensitivity, because, again, you compare it to LGBT plus specific services. Excuse me. And 85% felt that they were respected. So you can compare the two and show that there is an issue with the way mainstream society treats queer people. There is still that hostility present. It does point out we need these services, but they're being defunded by the government. They're being stripped back. And that is a big fucking issue, We are losing a lot of the support services we've had to build for blood, sweat and tears over the last, several decades. Because the government is just rolling back everything. There's a big push against the unhoused in Los Angeles, California, US, and all across the US, it seems, and that cuts against race issues big time. Also LGBT plus issues as well, because LGBT plus folk are disproportionately present in the homeless community, especially LGBT plus youth, because sadly we still live in a world where a teenager comes out as LGBT plus and they get kicked out of their house. you know, and this tragedy has been with the queer community for decades. I was doing some research into Sylvia Rivera, and like people know that she was assaulted whilst like fighting for queer liberation, all that. What a lot of people don't know is she she started wearing makeup around 10 years of age, I think it was. Um, Her grandmother, who she lived with, absolutely hated that, so she had to leave home aged 11, at which point she was then forced into sexual slavery, you know, until she was adopted by the drag community who took her out of that. So, again, homelessness and all of the risks that come with that, that is also something that disproportionately impacts the queer community. Ash, I wouldn't trust a cop in any context, but especially in the context of sexual and or hate crimes, I'm actively terrified of police being anywhere near the situation. I agree with that. Seth, it's honestly wild how I've never even considered calling the police. Like, it just doesn't enter my mind as an option rather than an intentional choice of something. But that's the thing, like, we have to, like, yeah. Certain demographics have to consider that, and I know police violence against black people and also the Asian community is extremely high. So like that's a lot of that's one of those things that the privileged take for granted, that they can call the police and like the police are gonna help them. They're not not only are they not going to like dismiss everything, but they're not going to actively hurt them, harm them, you know. But yeah. And Divine, this isn't on topic, but at all. But I think your hair looks great. Thank you. It feels absolutely dreadful right now, but I'm glad you are fooled. But yeah, so the whole situation here just reeks of everything. I was reading something else. Oh, right, yes. Another point that I've mentioned here is also the fact that there is a difference in need for queer people who are victims of a hate crime versus non-queer, or I say, non-marginalized groups who aren't victim of a hate crime, this victim of a regular crime. And that's the fear of reoccurrence. And I know, like, anyone who's been victim of a crime may be, like, afraid of it happening again. But the thing about a hate crime is is a public act against an entire community. It's not. That's why it's treated as more severe, because it does impact the community as a whole. And if you're a victim of the hate crime, if you're the victim of the mugging, you know, besides the choices made by the culprit, very often things can be chalked up to like wrong place, wrong time. Okay, you were unlucky that you were the target, that you know they followed down the dark street and mugged you. If you are a victim of a hate crime, you were picked out of everyone because of who you are. And you don't stop being who you are following that crime. So the chances of a reoccurrence are much, much higher and much more in the front of your mind. So there is a greater need to address, you know, the impacts of a hate crime using support services. But sadly, again, the government is just gutting them. South K, whenever there was a shooting or something in my area, I was more stressed about increased cop presence as a result rather than violence itself. That's the whole notion behind the rich get richer and the poor get prison. The over-policing of typically working class was the focus in the sociology, but now it's moved on to more marginalized communities which intersect with the working class. But yeah, the rich get richer, the poor get prison. Uncle Riva, I was picked up by a trans cop once. I showed them my trans flag. They didn't recognize it. I explained, and they replied, "Oh, I don't go on for that kind of stuff." Shit, yeah. That's that also shows the sort of like LGBT plus person the police force attracts, who is willing to like ignore that group consciousness that we've all formed through generations of police violence. You know, this kind of just reminds me of like people arguing that the police were there at the first Stonewall, not stopping to think why they were there at the first Stonewall. You know, there was a couple of posts recently. The police were at the first Stonewall. A few of them were probably, you know, closeted gays. And it's like, that doesn't make things better all of a sudden. But yeah. Okay. However, there is one similarity between both services I should note. And that's the fact that both services had 9% of respondents say their experiences weren't taken seriously. So I do need to point out, like, LGBT plus specific services, and I'm going to hazard a guess here for other marginalised specific services, aren't a total magic fix. They're not a utopian fix. They don't suddenly deal with everything. There are still issues that are shared between both services, but there's much less, there are fewer issues involved. You know, that's why the satisfaction... I've got cotton now. That's why the satisfaction rate of the specific services was twice as high as that of the generic support services. Anything you'd like to add on that?
Not really.
Okay. As noted, the report concludes that, quote, for many respondents, LGBT plus hate crime was something they experienced on a regular basis. These incidents range from verbal and online abuse and harassment to physical and sexual violence, suggesting that LGBT plus hate crime remains a persistent and insidious problem. End quote. And hopefully that is something we can all agree on.